March 17, 1979. The basement switching room of the Federal Communications Building in downtown Washington hummed with the steady drone of mechanical relays, their rhythmic clicking like 1,000 metallic insects working in perfect synchronization. Technician Robert Mitchell traced his finger along the maze of copper wires that connected the nation's capital to the rest of the world, searching for the source of a signal anomaly that had appeared in the overnight maintenance logs. He expected to find a loose connection, perhaps a corroded contact, nothing more than routine maintenance in the endless labyrinth of Cold War telecommunications. He had no way of knowing that within the next hour, his discovery would expose one of the most brazen Soviet espionage operations ever conducted on American soil, unravel a network that had been listening to classified government conversations for nearly 3 years, and set in motion a counterintelligence investigation that would reach the highest levels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Security Agency. The truth waiting in that tangle of wires would prove that sometimes the most dangerous spies aren't the ones carrying microfilm in hollow coins or meeting in shadowy parking garages, but the ones who never need to leave their listening posts at all. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Robert Mitchell had worked for Bell Atlantic for 11 years, spending most of that time in the underground nerve centers where America's phone conversations traveled as electrical pulses through copper arteries. At 42 years old, he'd developed the kind of technical intuition that comes only from years of tracing circuits and debugging systems that most people never knew existed. His colleagues called him Bobby Wires, a nickname he'd earned after successfully diagnosing a mysterious crosstalk problem that had stumped 3 senior engineers. The issue had turned out to be a single misaligned relay contact in a bank of 10,000 switches. On that Tuesday morning, Bobby arrived at the Federal Communications Building at his usual time, 6:30 in the morning, carrying his metal toolbox and a thermos of black coffee that his wife Ellen had prepared. The building itself was an unremarkable structure from the outside, a 7-story concrete block that might have housed accountants or insurance adjusters. But beneath its mundane exterior lay one of the most critical telecommunications hubs on the East Coast, handling secure phone lines for multiple government agencies, including several that officially did not exist. The anomaly Bobby had been assigned to investigate appeared in the overnight logs as a slight voltage fluctuation on line 734 Alpha, one of several trunk lines that carried encrypted communications between the State Department and various overseas embassies. The fluctuation itself was minimal, barely 0.02 volts, the kind of reading that most technicians would have dismissed as instrument error or normal variance. But the maintenance supervisor, a cautious man named Gerald Hartman, had learned during his own decades in the field that in the world of sensitive communications there was no such thing as a meaningless anomaly. Bobby descended the stairs into the basement switching room, a space roughly the size of a basketball court, filled floor to ceiling with rack-mounted equipment that represented millions of dollars in telephone infrastructure. The air smelled of machine oil and ozone, with an underlying metallic tang that reminded him of penny candy. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their tubes occasionally flickering in a way that always made Bobby think they were trying to communicate in Morse code. He found line 734 Alpha in the 3rd equipment rack from the eastern wall, a cluster of mechanical relays and crossbar switches that clicked and hummed with every call that passed through them. Bobby set his toolbox on the concrete floor and pulled out his volt-ohm meter, a battered device that had served him faithfully through 1,000 repairs. He clipped the meter's leads onto the terminal posts and watched the needle swing across the dial, measuring the voltage with the precision of a surgeon taking a patient's pulse. The reading confirmed the overnight log. There was indeed a voltage drop, small but persistent, suggesting that something was drawing current from the line. Bobby's first thought was a partial short circuit, perhaps moisture in a connector or a frayed wire touching the equipment frame. He began the methodical process of isolation, disconnecting sections of the circuit one at a time to narrow down the location of the problem. 20 minutes into this process, Bobby noticed something that made him pause. When he disconnected the outgoing trunk line, The voltage fluctuation didn't disappear as it should have. Instead, it shifted slightly, as if whatever was causing the drain had adjusted to the change in circuit conditions. That wasn't how short circuits behaved. Short circuits were passive failures, dumb mistakes of physics where electricity took an unintended path. This felt different. This felt responsive. Bobby set down his meter and examined the equipment rack more carefully, this time looking not for obvious damage but for anything that seemed out of place. He'd been working in this building for 6 years, and he knew this equipment the way a pianist knows their instrument. Every wire, every terminal, every relay had its proper place in the carefully organized chaos of the switching room. That's when he saw it. A wire that didn't belong. It was a thin strand of copper, no thicker than a human hair, carefully threaded along the edge of the equipment frame, where it would be almost invisible unless you were looking for it specifically. The wire was the same color as the standard installation cables, clearly chosen to blend in, but its routing was wrong. It connected to the trunk line at a point that shouldn't have had any connections at all, and then it disappeared up into the cable tray that ran along the ceiling. Bobby felt his pulse quicken. In 11 years of telecommunications work, he'd seen plenty of mistakes, unauthorized repairs, and even a few cases of telephone fraud where people had illegally tapped into lines to make free long-distance calls. But this was different. This wire was too carefully placed, too deliberately hidden, and it was attached to a line that carried encrypted government communications. He grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox and followed the wire with the beam, tracing its path along the ceiling tray. The wire ran for approximately 15 feet before it turned down another equipment rack, this one containing switching gear for local residential phone service. Bobby climbed onto a stepladder and followed the wire down through the residential switches until it terminated at a small metal box that had been mounted behind a panel of legitimate equipment. The box was approximately the size of a paperback book, painted in the same gray as the surrounding equipment, with no manufacturer labels or identifying marks. 2 wires entered it, the tap line from the government trunk and a connection to the residential phone system. Bobby carefully removed the box from its mounting bracket and brought it down to his workbench under better light. His hands were shaking slightly as he opened the box. Inside, he found a circuit board populated with components that looked like they came from a military-grade communications device. There was a small transformer, several precision capacitors, and an integrated circuit chip that Bobby didn't recognize. But what caught his attention most was what appeared to be a miniature tape recorder mechanism, no larger than a cigarette lighter, connected to a timer circuit. Bobby understood immediately what he was looking at. This was a wiretap, a sophisticated one, designed to record conversations from the government trunk line and store them until they could be retrieved. But the connection to the residential phone system suggested something even more clever. The device was designed to transmit its recordings over regular phone lines, probably during off-peak hours when the activity would be less likely to be noticed, disguised as normal telephone traffic. He set the device back on the workbench and stepped away from it, suddenly aware that he was standing in the middle of what might be a crime scene, or worse, an espionage operation. His mind raced through the implications. This wasn't amateur hour. This was professional work, the kind of installation that required detailed knowledge of the telephone system, access to the building, and technical sophistication that went well beyond simple telephone fraud. Bobby looked at his watch. 7:45 in the morning. Gerald Hartman wouldn't arrive until 8 o'clock. Bobby considered waiting for his supervisor, but another thought occurred to him. If this device was part of an ongoing operation, someone might be monitoring it remotely. His discovery might already have been noticed. The voltage drop he'd detected could have been caused by increased activity, as the operators tried to retrieve data before their tap was discovered. He climbed the stairs back to the main floor and found the building's security office, a small room near the main entrance where a guard named Morris Edwards spent his shifts monitoring a bank of closed-circuit television screens and signing in visitors. Morris was ex-military, a Vietnam veteran who'd served with the Army Signal Corps before taking this civilian security job. If anyone in the building could be trusted with something like this, it was Morris. Morris looked up from his newspaper as Bobby entered the security office, his expression shifting from casual greeting to concern as he registered Bobby's face. "What's wrong, Mitchell?" Morris asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Bobby closed the door behind him. "I need you to call the FBI," Bobby said quietly. "Right now. I found something in the basement that they need to see." Morris set down his newspaper. "What kind of something?" "A wiretap," Bobby said, "on one of the government trunk lines. A sophisticated one. This isn't kids stealing long distance. This is professional." Morris studied Bobby's face for a long moment, then picked up the phone. He didn't ask any more questions. In 1979, in a building that handled classified communications in the nation's capital, the word wiretap had only one meaning that mattered. The FBI arrived within 30 minutes, faster than Bobby would have thought possible. 2 agents in dark suits identified themselves as Special Agent Raymond Keller and Special Agent Sandra Chen from the Washington Field Office's Counterintelligence Division. They were accompanied by a technical specialist named Dr. William Grayson, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses who carried a metal case that looked like it might contain medical instruments. Bobby led them down to the basement switching room and showed them the wiretap device still sitting on his workbench where he'd left it. He explained how he discovered it, starting with the voltage anomaly in the overnight logs and ending with his decision to call security rather than his supervisor. As he talked, Dr. Grayson photographed the device from multiple angles and made notes in a leather-bound notebook. Special Agent Keller examined the tapwire's connection point on the government trunk line, his expression growing more serious as he traced its path. "How many people have regular access to this room?" he asked. Bobby considered the question. "Probably 15 to 20 technicians and engineers," he said, "plus maintenance staff, cleaning crew, building security. Anyone with legitimate business in the communications areas would have access if they showed proper identification." "And the government trunk lines are all in this one section?" Chen asked, gesturing at the equipment racks. "Mostly," Bobby confirmed. "There's some redundancy spread across other racks for backup purposes, but the primary trunks for State Department, Defense Department, and a couple of agencies that don't put their names on the doors are all within 20 feet of where we're standing." "Doctor." Grayson carefully disconnected the wiretap device and placed it in a clear plastic evidence bag. "This is Soviet," he said quietly. "I'd stake my reputation on it. The circuit design, the component selection, even the soldering technique. This is KGB work." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Bobby felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the basement's air conditioning. He'd suspected espionage, but having it confirmed by an FBI specialist made it suddenly terrifyingly real. "How long has it been here?" Keller asked Bobby. Bobby shook his head. "No way to know for certain. Could be weeks, could be years. These devices don't require maintenance once they're installed. As long as the power supply holds up, they'll run indefinitely." Dr. Grayson examined the device through the plastic bag. "Based on the dust accumulation and the oxidation on the wire connections, I'd estimate at least 2 years, possibly 3. This has been operating for a long time. Agent Chen had been studying the connection to the residential phone system. So they've been transmitting the recordings out over regular phone lines," she said. "That's actually brilliant. No need to physically retrieve the tapes, no risk of being caught accessing the building. They just dial in during the middle of the night, download the recordings and hang up. It would look like any other phone call in the logs. Assuming they didn't get greedy," Dr. Grayson added. "If they transmitted too frequently or during peak hours, it might have been noticed. But if they were disciplined, kept it to once a week or once a month, always during low traffic periods, it could easily have gone undetected for years." Bobby felt sick. He thought about all the conversations that had passed through that trunk line over the past 2 or 3 years. Diplomatic communications about arms negotiations with the Soviets, intelligence briefings, policy discussions about the strategic balance in Europe. The Soviets hadn't just been listening to one conversation or one official. They'd been listening to everything. "Can you trace where the recordings were being sent?" Keller asked. Dr. Grayson shook his head. "Not from the device itself. But we can check the building's phone records for unusual outgoing calls during off-peak hours. If we're lucky, they used a local number, maybe a safe house in the DC area. If we're unlucky, they routed it through multiple switches to obscure the destination." Over the next 6 hours, The basement switching room transformed into a crime scene. More FBI personnel arrived, along with technicians from the National Security Agency and a team of counterintelligence specialists from the Defense Department. They photographed every wire, documented every connection, and began the painstaking process of examining the entire communications infrastructure for additional taps. Bobby was asked to remain available for questioning, so he sat on a folding chair near his workbench, watching the specialists work. He'd expected to spend his day fixing a minor electrical problem. Instead, he'd uncovered an espionage operation that was probably being discussed at that very moment in the offices of the FBI director and possibly even the White House. Special Agent Chen sat down next to him around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the break room upstairs. She handed one to Bobby. "You did good work today, Mitchell," she said. "A lot of technicians would have just disconnected that wire, logged it as unauthorized equipment, and moved on. The fact that you recognized it as something more serious that took real awareness." Bobby sipped the coffee. It was terrible. The kind of bitter industrial coffee that every government building seemed to serve, but he was grateful for it nonetheless. "I've worked around sensitive communications long enough to know that nothing in this building is accidental," he said. "When I saw how carefully that wire was placed, how much effort had gone into hiding it, I knew it had to be something serious." Chen nodded. "We're going to need you to keep this completely confidential. No telling your wife, your friends, not even your supervisor beyond what's absolutely necessary. As far as anyone outside this investigation is concerned, you found a faulty piece of equipment that needed to be replaced. Nothing more." Bobby understood. In the world of counterintelligence, the fewer people who knew about a compromise, the better. If the Soviets learned that their tap had been discovered, they would shut down their entire operation, destroy evidence, pull out their agents. The FBI needed time to trace the network, identify the people responsible, maybe even turn the situation to their advantage. The investigation that followed Bobby's discovery would eventually be designated Operation Silent Partner by the FBI. Over the next 9 months, federal agents would identify 6 additional wiretaps in government communications buildings across Washington, all using variations of the same sophisticated design. The phone records from the Federal Communications Building revealed that the tap had been transmitting recordings to a residential phone number in Arlington, Virginia, registered to a man named Viktor Petrov. Petrov, it turned out, was a low-level employee at the Soviet Embassy's Cultural Attaché Office, a position that served as cover for his actual role as a communications specialist with the KGB's Washington Residentura. The FBI placed him under surveillance and discovered a network of 3 other Soviet intelligence officers who were part of the wiretap operation. But the investigation revealed something even more significant. The wiretaps had been installed by someone with legitimate access to the communications buildings, someone who knew exactly where the government trunk lines were located and how to tap them without triggering security alarms. The FBI eventually identified the inside man as Thomas Richter, a senior telecommunications engineer who'd been recruited by the KGB during a business trip to Moscow in 1975. Richter had been under financial pressure, facing divorce and mounting debts, when a Soviet trade representative had approached him at a hotel bar in Moscow. The conversation had been casual at first, just friendly talk about technical subjects, but it had led to subsequent meetings where money was offered in exchange for small favors. By the time Richter realized he'd been recruited as a spy, he was already too deep to back out. The KGB had recordings of his early cooperation, enough to send him to prison for espionage if he didn't continue. For nearly 4 years, Richter had been installing wiretaps in government communications facilities, using his legitimate access and technical expertise to place Soviet listening devices on some of America's most sensitive phone lines. The intelligence gathered through these taps included diplomatic cables about the SALT II arms limitation negotiations, internal State Department discussions about Soviet intentions in Afghanistan, and Pentagon communications about NATO force deployments in Europe. The FBI arrested Richter in November 1979 at his apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland. He confessed within hours, exhausted by years of living a double life and relieved that it was finally over. His cooperation led to a larger operation to identify and arrest Soviet intelligence officers operating in the United States, resulting in the expulsion of 17 Soviet diplomats who were declared persona non grata for espionage activities. Viktor Petrov and the other KGB officers involved in the wiretap operation managed to leave the country before they could be arrested, protected by diplomatic immunity. But the damage to Soviet intelligence operations in Washington was severe. The networks they'd spent years building were rolled up, their sources were identified, and their methods were compromised. The CIA and NSA used the information from Operation Silent Partner to develop new security protocols for government communications, including electronic surveillance detection equipment that would make similar wiretaps much more difficult to install in the future. Bobby Mitchell continued working for Bell Atlantic, though his role changed significantly after the investigation. The FBI recruited him as a consultant to help train federal agents and security personnel in telecommunications security, teaching them how to recognize unauthorized equipment and suspicious modifications in phone systems. He would eventually testify before a closed session of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence about the vulnerabilities in government communications infrastructure. But he never forgot that March morning, when a routine voltage fluctuation had led him into the hidden world of Cold War espionage. Years later, when he retired from Bell Atlantic, he kept a framed copy of a letter he'd received from FBI Director William Webster, thanking him for his service to national security. The letter didn't mention specifics, maintaining the classification of Operation Silent Partner, but Bobby knew what it meant. His technical intuition and willingness to trust his instincts had helped close a dangerous intelligence leak at a critical moment in American history. The wiretap device itself ended up in a classified collection at the National Security Agency's National Cryptologic Museum, though it wouldn't be displayed publicly until decades later when the details of Cold War espionage operations were finally declassified. Visitors to the museum today can see the small grey box behind glass, innocuous and unremarkable, with a placard that explains how this simple device had listened to thousands of hours of sensitive conversations between American officials. What the placard doesn't fully capture is the human dimension of the story, the fact that espionage often comes down to small details noticed by observant people doing ordinary jobs. Bobby Mitchell wasn't a spy or a counterintelligence agent. He was a telephone technician who knew his equipment well enough to recognize when something didn't belong. In the shadowy world of Cold War intelligence, where nations spent billions on satellites and code-breaking computers, sometimes the most important discoveries came from someone with a toolbox and a flashlight, willing to follow a wire that didn't make sense. The Soviet wiretap operation that Bobby uncovered represented a significant intelligence failure, but it also demonstrated something important about security. No technical defense is perfect, no encryption system is unbreakable. The human element, whether it's the insider who betrays his trust or the technician who notices something wrong, remains the most critical factor in both espionage and counter-espionage. Thomas Richter served 12 years in federal prison before being released on parole in 1991, just months before the Soviet Union itself collapsed. In interviews he gave years later, after the details of his case were partially declassified, he spoke about the psychology of betrayal, how small compromises led to larger ones, how financial pressure and personal problems made him vulnerable to recruitment. But he also spoke about the moment he was arrested, the overwhelming sense of relief that came with the end of his double life. Living as a spy, he said, was like carrying a great weight that grew heavier every day. He'd spent years looking over his shoulder, wondering if today would be the day he was caught, knowing that every wiretap he installed brought him closer to that inevitable moment. The irony, Richter noted, was that his downfall came not from some sophisticated counterintelligence operation or advanced detection technology, but from a simple voltage fluctuation noticed by a careful technician during routine maintenance. All the tradecraft in the world, all the KGB training and security procedures, couldn't protect against someone like Bobby Mitchell, who simply knew his job well and trusted his instincts when something seemed wrong. For the KGB, the loss of the Washington wiretap network was a serious blow. The intelligence gathered through those taps had given Soviet leadership insights into American diplomatic and military thinking at a crucial moment in the Cold War. The conversations recorded from the State Department trunk lines had revealed details about internal American debates on arms control, information that Soviet negotiators had used to their advantage in SALT II discussions. When the taps were discovered and the network rolled up, it created a significant intelligence gap for Moscow at exactly the wrong time. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 came just weeks after the arrests, and Soviet leadership found themselves operating without the kind of advance intelligence about American reactions that the wiretaps had previously provided. Some historians have argued that this intelligence gap contributed to miscalculations about how strongly the United States would respond to the Afghan invasion. Bobby Mitchell's discovery had also prompted a comprehensive security review of telecommunications infrastructure throughout the federal government. The review found multiple vulnerabilities that were subsequently addressed, including better access controls for sensitive communications facilities, more frequent security sweeps, and enhanced technical surveillance countermeasures. The changes made it significantly more difficult for foreign intelligence services to conduct similar operations in the future. But perhaps the most important lesson from the incident was about vigilance. The Soviet wiretaps had operated successfully for years because no one was specifically looking for them. The voltage fluctuation that led to their discovery was small enough that most technicians would have ignored it. It was only Bobby's attention to detail, his refusal to dismiss an anomaly no matter how small, that brought the operation to light. In the decades since, telecommunications security has become far more sophisticated. Modern encrypted communications use technologies that would have seemed like science fiction in 1979. Digital systems have replaced the mechanical relays and copper wires that Bobby Mitchell worked with. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Security depends on people paying attention, noticing things that are out of place, and having the awareness to recognize when something routine is actually something serious. Bobby himself reflected on this in a speech he gave at a telecommunications security conference in the mid-1990s, years after the details of Operation Silent Partner had been declassified. The technology changes, he told the audience of engineers and security professionals, but the mindset stays the same. Whether you're working with 19th century telegraph lines or 21st century fiber optics, security comes down to knowing your systems well enough to recognize when something is wrong and having the courage to act on that recognition. He also spoke about the personal impact of his discovery. For weeks after finding the wiretap, he'd had trouble sleeping, haunted by thoughts of the conversations that had been compromised, the policies that might have been affected, the potential damage to national security. He'd wondered if he could have found it sooner, if he'd been more attentive, if he'd questioned other anomalies more carefully. The FBI had assured him that he'd acted as quickly as anyone could have, that the tap was extremely well hidden, but Bobby still felt a lingering sense of responsibility. Eventually, he'd come to terms with what happened by focusing on the outcome. The wiretaps were discovered, the network was dismantled, the insider was caught, and security was improved. That was what mattered. Not the time that was lost, but the damage that was prevented from that point forward. Ellen Mitchell, Bobby's wife, had her own perspective on the events. She'd known something serious was happening when FBI agents began showing up at their home for interviews, when Bobby started receiving phone calls at odd hours, when he became withdrawn and preoccupied. But she'd also known not to ask too many questions. She'd been married to Bobby long enough to understand that some things had to remain confidential, that his work sometimes touched on matters of national security. Years later, when the story could finally be told, she admitted that she'd been frightened by how close her husband had come to serious danger. If the Soviets had realized their operation was about to be exposed, if they'd had people monitoring the building who noticed Bobby's discovery, things could have turned out very differently. The KGB had a history of eliminating people who threatened their operations. Bobby could have been made to look like a victim of an accident or a random crime. But Ellen also expressed pride in what Bobby had done. He'd seen something wrong and he'd done the right thing, despite the potential risks, despite the disruption it caused to their lives. That took a kind of courage that most people never have to demonstrate, she said. the courage to trust your judgment when it really matters. The Federal Communications Building itself underwent significant changes after the discovery of the wiretaps. Security was dramatically tightened, with new access controls, regular security sweeps, and electronic surveillance detection equipment installed throughout the facility. The days when a skilled insider could spend hours alone in the switching rooms, installing unauthorized equipment, were over. Every person who entered the building was logged, every access to sensitive areas was monitored, every piece of equipment was inventoried and inspected. Gerald Hartman, Bobby's supervisor, took the lessons from the incident seriously. He implemented new protocols requiring immediate investigation of any anomaly, no matter how small, in communications carrying classified information. The voltage fluctuation that Bobby had been assigned to investigate became a case study in his training program for new technicians, an example of why seemingly minor problems should never be dismissed without thorough investigation. Hartman also made sure that Bobby received proper recognition for his work, though the classified nature of the operation limited how public that recognition could be. Within Bell Atlantic's security-cleared personnel, Bobby became known as the technician who'd caught a Soviet spy operation. It was a reputation that opened doors for him later in his career, leading to consulting opportunities and speaking engagements in the specialized world of telecommunications security. The broader impact of Operation Silent Partner extended beyond the immediate security improvements. The incident became a wake-up call for the intelligence community about the vulnerability of physical telecommunications infrastructure. While much attention had been focused on protecting against electronic interception of signals, the possibility of physical taps on landlines had been somewhat neglected. The assumption had been that physical access to secure facilities would be sufficiently difficult to prevent such operations. The discovery proved that assumption wrong. A determined intelligence service with a recruited insider could overcome physical security measures. The lesson prompted a shift in thinking about communication security, emphasizing defense in depth, multiple layers of protection, and the importance of insider threat detection. The case also influenced how the FBI approached counterintelligence investigations. The success of Operation Silent Partner demonstrated the value of patient, methodical investigation rather than immediate arrests. By taking time to map out the entire network, identify all the participants, and understand the full scope of the operation, the FBI was able to achieve a much more complete disruption of Soviet intelligence activities than they would have with quick arrests. This patient approach became a model for future counterintelligence operations. Rather than simply catching individual spies, the goal became understanding and dismantling entire networks, using the intelligence gathered from one operation to inform and support others. The information from the wiretap investigation led to insights that helped the FBI identify and neutralize other Soviet intelligence operations in subsequent years. For Bobby Mitchell, the most lasting impact of his discovery was a deeper appreciation for the hidden dimensions of ordinary work. Before that March morning in 1979, he'd thought of himself as simply a telephone technician, someone who kept the communications infrastructure running. After, he understood that his work had national security implications, that the systems he maintained carried information that shaped the course of history. This awareness changed how he approached his job. He became more meticulous, more security conscious, more willing to question things that seemed out of place. He also became an advocate for better security training for telecommunications workers, arguing that the people who worked with these systems every day needed to understand what they were protecting and why it mattered. The story of how a phone company technician found a wiretap that exposed a Soviet spy became one of those Cold War tales that circulated quietly among people with security clearances, told in training sessions and security briefings as an example of how vigilance could make a difference. For decades, the details remained classified, known only to those directly involved and to the counterintelligence professionals who studied such cases. When the story was finally declassified in the early 2000s, it generated renewed interest in Cold War espionage history. Journalists interviewed Bobby Mitchell, now retired and in his 60s, about his role in uncovering the operation. He appeared in documentaries about Cold War intelligence operations, his testimony adding a personal dimension to what might otherwise have been just another classified case file. In these interviews, Bobby was typically modest about his role. He emphasized that he'd simply done his job, that any competent technician would have noticed the anomaly and investigated it. But others who knew the case weren't so sure. They pointed out that multiple other technicians had likely encountered similar anomalies in the years the taps were operating and had dismissed them as instrument error or normal variance. Bobby's decision to trust his instincts and investigate thoroughly made the difference. The National Security Agency in particular saw the case as a valuable lesson in the importance of technical expertise in counterintelligence. In an era increasingly dominated by electronic surveillance and sophisticated encryption systems, Operation Silent Partner reminded everyone that old-fashioned physical wiretaps installed by knowledgeable insiders could still be devastatingly effective. The case prompted NSA to develop better training programs for identifying and removing physical surveillance devices and to work more closely with the telecommunications industry on security standards. Dr. William Grayson, the FBI technical specialist who had examined the wiretap device Bobby discovered, later wrote a classified analysis of Soviet technical surveillance capabilities based on the equipment recovered from Operation Silent Partner. His report revealed that the Soviets had developed remarkably sophisticated miniature recording and transmission systems designed to operate reliably in the harsh environment of telecommunications switching rooms with minimal maintenance. The devices used components that were, in many cases, more advanced than what was available in American commercial electronics at the time. This suggested that the KGB's technical directorate had access to either the best Soviet military technology or, more troubling, Western components obtained through technology transfer or espionage. The analysis helped identify vulnerabilities in export controls for sensitive electronics and led to tighter restrictions on technology transfers to Soviet bloc countries. Thomas Richter's interrogation also provided valuable insights into how the KGB recruited and handled technical sources. His case became a textbook example of the vulnerability created by personal financial problems, marital difficulties, and professional frustration. The KGB had identified him as a potential target, created opportunities for contact, built a relationship based on apparent friendship, and then gradually escalated the requests until Richter was fully committed to espionage. The psychological profile developed from Richter's case helped the FBI and other agencies identify potential insider threats before they could be recruited by foreign intelligence services. Programs were developed to identify employees facing financial or personal problems, not to punish them but to offer assistance and support that might prevent them from becoming vulnerable to recruitment. The approach recognized that insider threats often began with personal crises rather than ideological commitment. Viktor Petrov, the KGB officer who had operated the receiving end of the wiretap network, returned to Moscow after his cover was blown. According to information that emerged after the Cold War ended, he was not punished for the loss of the operation. Soviet intelligence recognized that the operation had been compromised through bad luck and good American counterintelligence, not through any failure on Petrov's part. He continued working in KGB technical operations until the organization was reorganized in the 1990s. In interviews given years later, after the end of the Cold War, Petrov spoke about the wiretap operation with a mixture of professional pride and retrospective acknowledgement of its moral implications. From a technical standpoint, he said, it was a successful operation that provided valuable intelligence for years. From a broader perspective, looking back after the Cold War had ended, he acknowledged that such operations contributed to the mistrust and tension that characterized the era. Petrov also expressed a certain professional respect for Bobby Mitchell. He said that in intelligence operations, you always know there's a risk of discovery, but you hope the other side isn't paying close enough attention to notice. When they do notice, when someone like Mitchell refuses to ignore a small anomaly, you have to acknowledge that you've been beaten by someone who was simply better at their job than you'd hoped. The telephone trunk line that had been tapped, line 734 Alpha, continued carrying government communications for years after the wiretap was removed. but it was never quite trusted in the same way again. Security protocols required that the most sensitive conversations be encrypted with additional layers of protection. The physical infrastructure was inspected more frequently. The assumption that physical security alone was sufficient protection had been shattered. Eventually, as telecommunications technology evolved, the old mechanical switching systems that Bobby Mitchell had worked with were replaced by digital systems with built-in security features. The copper wires and mechanical relays gave way to fiber optic cables and computerized switches that were, in theory at least, more resistant to physical tapping. But the lesson remained relevant. As long as humans have access to systems, there will be the potential for human compromise. The tools change, but the vulnerabilities persist. Bobby Mitchell's story became part of the informal, oral tradition of telecommunications security professionals. At industry conferences and security training sessions, his name would come up as an example of technical excellence and security awareness. Young engineers entering the field would hear about the technician who discovered a Soviet wiretap and learn the lesson that attention to detail matters, that seemingly small problems can have large implications, that trusting your professional instincts is important. In his later years, Bobby would occasionally be asked if he'd do anything differently if he could go back to that March morning in 1979. He always gave the same answer. The only thing he'd change would be to call the FBI even sooner before examining the wiretap device as thoroughly as he did. In retrospect, he realized that by disconnecting and examining the device, he'd taken risks he didn't fully appreciate at the time. If the device had been booby-trapped, or if Soviet handlers had been monitoring it and sent someone to protect their investment, things could have gone very wrong. But he also acknowledged that his technical examination of the device had provided valuable intelligence. His documentation of how the tap was connected, how it transmitted data, and what capabilities it had, gave the FBI crucial information for their investigation. Sometimes, he said, you have to balance caution against the need to gather intelligence, and you hope you make the right choice. Ellen Mitchell had her own perspective on whether Bobby had done the right thing. She was clear that he had, but she also acknowledged the personal cost. The stress of the investigation, the security restrictions on discussing what had happened, the lingering worry about potential retaliation, all took a toll on their family life. Their children, teenagers at the time, knew something serious had happened, but couldn't be told the details. It created a distance that took years to bridge. But Ellen also believed that some things were more important than personal comfort. The wiretaps were compromising national security, giving America's adversaries access to sensitive information that could have affected everything from arms control negotiations to military deployments. Bobby had stumbled into a situation where he could make a difference, and he'd done so. That was something to be proud of, even if it came with a cost. The Federal Communications Building where Bobby made his discovery continued operating as a critical telecommunications hub until the late 1990s, when advancing technology and changing security requirements led to its closure. The building was eventually sold and converted to office space for private tenants. The basement switching room where Bobby had found the wiretap was gutted during the renovation, the old equipment removed and scrapped. But before the building was converted, the FBI conducted one final security sweep, checking for any surveillance devices that might have been installed over the decades. They found none, but the sweep itself was a testament to how the incident had changed thinking about telecommunications security. What had once been an afterthought had become a rigorous, ongoing process. Bobby attended the building's decommissioning ceremony in 1998, invited as one of the technicians who had served there during its most critical years. Standing in the lobby, looking at the stairs that led down to the now-empty basement, he reflected on how much had changed since that March morning 19 years earlier. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the telecommunications infrastructure he'd worked with had been replaced by systems he barely recognized. But the fundamental lesson remained constant. Security depends on people paying attention, recognizing anomalies, and having the courage to investigate when something seems wrong. Technology evolves, threats change, but the human element, for better or worse, remains the critical factor in both creating vulnerabilities and discovering them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.